pleasure today to have Dr. Noah Askin with us. Dr. Askin is currently a professor at the University of California's Merage School of Business, and he spent nearly a decade teaching and directing executive development programs at INSEAD in France, which has been heralded as the business school for the world. So let me tell you how I got to ask Dr. Askin to come and talk to us today. I have received in the last, probably month, probably about 16 messages from viewers and also listeners, right? Because this comes out on video as well, asking me to do an episode on the topic of creativity. And for, I don't know, just maybe Noah, because we've been interacting together recently, I immediately thought of you. And I said, oh, I know who I'm going to ask to come and talk about this. So I asked him to join us today to talk a little bit about this important topic of creativity and also its importance in relationship to leadership and innovation. So Dr. Askin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Janet. And please feel free to call me Noah.
Okay.
But thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So I always ask the same question because I find that our listeners are really interested in your background and your background is really fascinating. So if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about, okay, so who are you? How'd you get to be doing what you're doing today? And a little bit about what you've done in the past.
Sure. So I think my path to here is kind of one of in retrospect, I can tell you a nice linear story, but at the time it very much did not feel like that. You know, I was a psychology major in undergrad because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I found it interesting, and then ended up in consulting for a couple of years because I didn't know what to do, and it looked like it could be interesting or something that people did coming out of an Ivy League school, and didn't love that, and then made a transition to start up in the educational services space, and because that seemed like a good next step. There was nothing sort of piecing this together, not a lot of forethought. And, following that for a couple of years, I just did what a lot of people who don't know what they want to be when they grow up do, and went to get an MBA, and found myself at the University of Chicago applying for jobs that I had already had and wasn't that interested in the first place. And thought, these people in front of the classroom seem to have an interesting gig. And I was fortunate that one of the faculty members at the University of Chicago is a guy named Damon Phillips, who studied jazz and networks. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that as an academic and then teach in a business school. And he was kind enough to meet with me, and one thing led to another. I ended up in the PhD program and studying business administration from an organizational perspective, and then also kind of ended up in the sociology department as well. And sitting at the intersection of organizations and sociology is networks and how organizations compete with each other, how things go on internally in organizations. And part of my application, looking back recently into the PhD, was wanting to better understand music and how music gets created, why it's creative, how people are creative, what's going on with that industry that should allegedly be run on creativity. Wow. And it's something that I have since found myself back into and been doing research on now for over a decade, and it's trickled into my teaching and just so much of what I read, even outside of my professional life, is around creativity and music and how to foster these things.
Wow, that is so fascinating. Now, let me ask you, are you a musician?
Very, very mediocre. I played piano forever growing up and got to be okay. And then, like any self-respecting middle-aged bearded white man, I decided to take up the acoustic guitar about 10 years ago. And, that's coming along, and I can play for my kids because they don't really know that I'm not very good yet. I think they're starting to figure it out. But I think when you talk to lots of academics, they tend to study things that confound them. And that's what interests them, is the fact that they don't quite get it. And so for me, creativity, I think, is this thing that I've always been in awe of. And that's what's led me to study it.
Yeah. So this is fascinating. And the music connection is like amazing. So let me ask you this. You studied creativity. And why do you think it's so important for leaders?
To some extent, and this is probably overstating the case, I think creativity is one of the primary things that makes us human. Our ability to come up with something new or to solve a problem in a new or a different way. And I think particularly in light of all of the challenges that we face as a society right now, whether it's the massive, large scale climate related challenges that we face, whether it's the more economic challenges that we face on a national or local level, all of them require some degree of creativity, some of them a lot of creativity, in order to address these problems and solve them. And I think because creativity is a little bit of a different way of thinking than we are often trained for throughout primary school and even through a lot of higher education, I think it's one of those skills that people can develop, but I think it's one that we don't often. And I think, to be an effective leader, you've got to be able to solve problems. And my own personal opinion, and having observed people in the workplace for a while now, leads me to believe that your ability to solve problems has a direct correlation, or is directly correlated to your ability to be creative, to think differently about how to approach a problem that's existed for a while, or even something that doesn't seem like a problem, but maybe could be solved better. That's the essence of creativity. I think it is one of the fundamental skill sets of any leader, is the ability to take an existing problem or even an existing solution and find some new, different, ideally better way to solve it.
What's so interesting about that, Noah? I hear so many executives that I work with will say, I'm a problem solver. But then in the same breath, they'll say, but I'm not creative. I'm totally not creative. And so many people that I talk to will say, I'm not creative. What would you say to them?
So I think everybody has potential for creativity, and everybody is creative in their own way. But there's the problem of the things that we're used to doing don't feel creative to us, right? If a huge portion of creativity is novelty,
Right.
if it's something that we've been doing for a long period of time, we don't feel like this is novel, even though the way that I think about a given problem might be totally novel to everybody else that I work with, or the rest of an industry even, but I've just thought about it this way for a decade or even just a couple months. But because it's the way that I think about it and it seems natural and normal to me, I don't deem it as creative. And so a huge portion of creativity is basically trying to force yourself to step outside of your daily routine and acknowledge, wait a second, I actually do have some creative abilities and creative potential, and I exercise those things regularly. But because they're just things that I do, it doesn't feel creative, right? To really do that, you're going to want to have a lot of novelty to what you do. And if you are kind of just putting out fires that come in front of across your path on a consistent basis, it doesn't feel very creative, even though other people may look at it and go like, wow, that's pretty insightful. That's pretty different.
What would you say creativity is then?
Well, I can give you the academic definition,
Oh, no.
of course.
Yes.
No, I mean, the way that it is often talked about academically, it is novelty and usefulness. And usefulness is obviously where a lot of, actually on both of those things, subjectivity comes into play. Making a case for novelty is probably a little bit easier than usefulness. Is usefulness to whom, in what contexts,
right.
How. And so, and I think especially when it comes to art, whether that's music or painting or movies, judging usefulness is where things really start to get a little hairy. But to me, I think creativity really is a function of trying to solve a problem from a new and different perspective. And that new and different perspective does not have to be new or different to the world. In fact, it most likely won't be, but to you and to the immediate surroundings that you find yourself in. If that's different, that's creativity.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it right there. That's what's intimidating to people, is they think it has to be novel. That, this has already been done, or somebody else has thought of that. And how many new ideas are there really in the world? And so I think that's where people get stuck. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
So look, if you get hung up on needing to be the first of anything, forget it. Like, just, that's, the old cliche, there's nothing new under the sun, kind of holds, right? Unless you're at the forefront of like quantum computing, chances are whatever you're doing is, probably been done before, and that's okay. And taking something that's been done before and putting it in a new context is absolutely novel. Taking something that's been done in this context, but using it in a different way, that's novel. Like, there's so many different ways that novelty can play out. And I think, especially because we, and rightfully so, we lionize creative people who seem to be at the forefront of the arts, of science, of technology. it becomes daunting to feel like, well, I'm not going to be doing that. But if that's your comparison set, no one, practically no one in the world is doing anything creative. And so I think that's probably a wrong framing. And starting to get in touch with the capability to do that, and also the acknowledgement that I don't need to be putting out, I don't know, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to be novel and creative, right? That's a pretty absurd bar that very few people are ever going to achieve. And so I think lowering the stakes and the expectations a bit can be helpful.
Yeah, I love the way you say that. And let me ask you this. So do you think everyone's creative?
I think everybody has the capability to be. I think, in some ways it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? If you kind of feel like you're creative, you're going to do things in a way, even if they're the exact same things that other people are doing, that will just change your mindset about how you approach problems and how you approach kind of your day. I think that everybody has the capability to be. Now, some people will exercise that more than others. Some people will emphasize that skill set more than others. Some people will work to develop that skill set more than others.
Do you think this is something that can be developed? Do you think creativity can be developed, or you just have it or you don't?
Oh, 100% can be developed. Now, does that mean there are different natural endowments of creativity? Sure. Are there different ceilings on what people are capable of? Of course. But can anybody develop it further? Are there processes and skills that can be worked on over time? Of course. Like, just think about learning a language. If you learn it when you're, under 3 or under 5 or whatever the age is, it just comes naturally. And then your ability to learn languages after that is subsequently easier. Creativity is another one of those things that, even if you haven't been in touch with it from early on, although pretty much everybody is as a child, even if you haven't been, you can still develop the skills, understand the processes, be more comfortable with the types of, I would call it the culture of creativity, which means taking risks, being okay with failure, learning, trying again, putting a bunch of stuff out there and seeing how people respond to it. All of those things are processes and skills that can absolutely be developed.
The first thing I want to ask you is thinking about children, right? When you naturally watch children and they seem to be uninhibited by what people think. And so there's a natural creativity that comes out. And then there's the societal things that start happening where people start to become less creative. They feel as if, oh, this is stupid, et cetera. Do you think there's something to that? I mean, do you think there are things in the environment that inhibit people's creativity?
Oh, for sure. Lots of things. In fact, I teach a course right now to the undergraduates at UC Irvine at the business school. And I have one class session that is on creativity scars. And now that term, at least I heard it from a colleague of mine named Spencer Harrison, who's at INSEAD, who also does great research on creativity. And I know Brene Brown talks about it too. And creativity scars are basically these remnants of feeling as a child like you are creative. And then at some point, usually it tends to happen kind of sometime between the ages of about 7 and let's call it 14, 15, something like that, where a teacher, a music teacher, a parent, a relative, some adult authority figure kind of calls out something that you as a child have done as being not creative or not what you were supposed to do, or coloring outside the lines, for lack of a better term. And I think that moment for a lot of people resonates very strongly. And it was so interesting. I did this with 70 undergrads and had them actually like create a small project around that moment. And they came up with the most incredible, like really moving things that address that moment about a parent telling them this wasn't good enough, or a piano teacher saying this was not okay, or other students telling them that their style of dress was not acceptable, right? These sorts of things. And I think that kids, either through schooling or some other authority figure or some other kind of training, basically are told, like, your imagination no longer counts here. It's no longer sufficient. And I think helping people acknowledge that is part of a process of getting back in touch with the type of imagination and playfulness that they have as kids, and hopefully unlocking some of the judgment that stops people from feeling not only creative, but capable of being creative too.
Yeah, no, that sounds fascinating. Also, when you think about the messages people get in organizations, right? Being so data driven and not using your imagination so much, and that may or not be valued in an organization as well. So what do you think some ways, I love that. I love that example. What do you think some ways to develop creativity?
So some of it's just an intentional practice, like any skill set. If you build in regular things into your daily schedule or weekly schedule that allow you the freedom from the either the self or internalized judgment of others, is how you're going to start doing it. Honestly, I think having a hobby that you're just not very good at is a great way to start to think about creativity, because it means you don't care about the judgment. It's you care for the sake of whatever that hobby is itself. And that's a good way to realize that, you know what, this is just fun and it's engaging and I can mess around because I'm not that good at it, and who cares?
Right.
And so that's develop it personally. In a professional context, so much has to do with culture, right? I'm a sociologist, and so a lot of the way that I view the world comes down to the norms and the enforcement of norms that we put on ourselves and others. And so in an organizational context that is so bottom line, so execution focused, does not tolerate people taking chances, coming up with multiple potential solutions, trying them out, seeing what happens if one of them doesn't work out, learning from it, moving forward. It can be very difficult to develop that in your day-to-day role, just because there's not the bandwidth to be able to
support, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it can feel very, very risky. And I think that degree of risk that people feel harkens back to that creativity scar idea, right? It's
Right.
like, oh, I know that if I draw too far outside the lines here, I'm going to get publicly chastised or worse for it. Finding little daily situations that you can transgress those lines a little bit or from a new perspective, even if something simple like your commute to work, right? I know not a lot of people are doing that these days, but even if it's a commute to work, taking a different route, you're not going to consider that to be the world's most creative thing,
Right.
but it's going to give you a new perspective. It's going to make you realize there's multiple ways to do things. It's going to let you see some things that you don't otherwise see. Is that life-changing? No. But is that the foundation of starting to do little things that both help you address your creativity and realize, wait a second, I can do these small things on a day-to-day basis that allow me to feel that degree of freedom that I think a lot of kids feel, to be able to do that and feel creative themselves. And so there are little ways to transgress, there are bigger ways to transgress, and a lot of it depends on your own tolerance for that kind of risk. And a lot of it depends on the contexts you put yourself in.
As you're talking, Noah, there's so many things that are coming to my head. And one of them is this whole notion of the growth mindset. Having some sort of a growth mindset in order to be able to be creative. Because if you're so afraid of failure and you're a high achiever who needs external validation, it's hard to learn, right? So say a little bit about what you think about the mindset that's needed to be more creative as well.
Yeah, I think I would be willing to bet, and because I'm not a psychologist, I don't know quite as much about whether or not I'd be willing to bet that there's probably some research either that has taken place or is taking place on growth mindset and creativity, because it seems a natural fit. If you identify creativity as a muscle that can be developed,
Right.
chances are you're going to work at it. If you think it is something that you are innately endowed with or not, that you're just going to give up.
Right.
And so my guess is that probably is out there. That's a good thing to look into. I think mindset is huge, because so much, and I'm seeing this with my undergrad students, although this happens maybe even more so with executives and other leaders, is that sense of self-judgment, and restricting yourself. Oh, this isn't going to be good. People aren't going to like this. I'm not going to like this. This isn't going to be my best work. I'm not putting my best foot forward. If that's your feeling, you're never going to even allow yourself the repetitions, the reps to try these different things and just see what sticks, see what stands out to you, which is one of the essences of creativity, is just trying a lot of things and learning from them, but also seeing how people respond to them and how you respond to them with your own taste. And so if your mindset is one of self-judgment, and that can either be completely internalized or it can be your expectations of others' judgment, it's going to be really hard to overcome it. And look, our school system and our work lives and so much of what we do is internalizing that external judgment and really learning that if we stay within these lines, we're going to be okay. And that if you have so deeply internalized that you can't find your way out of it, it's going to be real hard to be creative or to find little ways to even push back against that so that you can ultimately become more creative.
Yeah, that is something I see so often in the work that I do with executives is I see that self-judgment. And I would say, and I'm not kidding, if I just did a real quick and dirty mathematical equation, they're probably at least 60% of my time in coaching engagements talking about that, the self-judgment and how that inhibits people, and also the search for external validation. And so I can see immediately how that would inhibit creativity. And so what do you think about this external validation thing for this? I mean, how do you think that relates? Because again, we're looking for somebody else to say that it was good. It was somebody else to tell us that, oh, well, that was even music, right? You talked about music and you talk about, well, I'm trying the acoustic guitar, but oh, well.
Yeah.
But looking for somebody else to say, well, that's good, so that must be creative. How do you let go of that?
I'm not convinced that as adults we can fully let go of it. I mean, maybe there's the rare character who is just super self-confident or oblivious, or maybe both, to be able to do that.
Right.
I think it's going to be in there, and the question is, can you calm those voices enough to allow yourself the space to experiment and the space to try something? Because if you are in a work environment, at the end of the day, stuff is going to come down to how other people view your contribution or view the product or service you're developing, right? That stuff matters. And so much of the innovation process can be keyed towards customer satisfaction and do customers engage in the way you want them to with whatever you're developing. And so that's built into the process. The question is, can you do enough behind the scenes in advance or incorporate that kind of feedback into what you're doing, not so that it doesn't become a straitjacket, but it becomes just another piece of information that informs what you're trying to do. But you'll note, if you look at lots of the most successful entrepreneurs, they'll talk about just running as many experiments as possible, trying as many things as possible, as quickly as possible, knowing that most of them are not going to ultimately lead to anything, but they're going to be part of the learning process. They're going to be part of the development of something, and just trying lots of things out. That's creative. And now there are degrees of creativity, but that in and of itself is creative. And so I think acknowledging that, being okay with it, is again one of these early steps towards going from just restricting yourself completely because of the potential of external validation to actually starting to feel more comfortable with it, working within the confines that it provides, but not completely hamstringing yourself with them.
Yeah. So how do you know you're being creative? Here's why I'm asking you that question. As I'm thinking about a client that I have that is, I mean, he's brilliant, and he basically recently just told me that he thinks his mind is like a pinball machine. It just, idea after idea after idea after idea. And he sees himself as being very creative. Other people that watch him sometimes think he's weird. Like, wow, that's the weirdest idea I've ever heard. So is that a good indicator that you're being creative when people think you're weird? You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
how do you know if you're being creative or you're just not focused? Well, that's, I guess,
right. So that's a difficult line to draw. Part of creativity is novelty, and some weirdness is going to be in there, right? And then what is the boundaries between kind of acceptable weirdness or helpful weirdness and just pure like antisocial weirdness? That I don't know. That's not my area to judge. But I think the being unfocused can be a part of creativity too. The question is, do you have some sort of reining in mechanism? And oftentimes that's a partner, a thought partner, or if you're a visionary CEO, having a COO who kind of pulls the reins a little bit, because you need that yin and the yang of lots of ideas, but then someone who's like, okay, now let's like try to tether this to reality to some extent.
Right.
Yeah. And it's very difficult to do both, both as an organization, certainly as an individual. I think it's really hard to do both. But I think having a counterweight that can tether these kind of wild and crazy, quote unquote, weird ideas to reality can be incredibly helpful. And then the question is there sufficient trust in that relationship such that the idea generator feels reasonably unencumbered to be able to do that, but that the person who's about implementation and execution also has things that they can work with? Because if you start weighting too heavily on one side or the other, you either lose the creative spirit or you lose the ability to actually execute on things. And this is what makes creativity in an organizational context so challenging, is finding what's the right time to go from ideation to execution, what's the right level of ideation, and how crazy can we get without kind of completely losing touch with customers or reality or whatever. But I think that's where people often will struggle, is figuring out how to get these two things right in the recipe.
Yeah, and you're talking about that recipe. I'm thinking immediately what's coming to my head is organizational ambidexterity, where
Mm-hmm.
you'll have one group that focuses on exploitation of what's happening right in the current marketplace, but also another group that focuses on exploration and exploring new opportunities. And what do you think about that? Like the concept of having, like, in the culture, having two separate groups, that some focus on innovation and some focus on exploitation of the current.
Yeah, that seems to be a generally accepted wisdom on how to do this best. What happens in lots of organizations that try to do this, you end up with lots of status problems. So part of what I studied actually for my dissertation was status and competition for status and rankings. And I was looking at organizations, but of course, in the process of doing that, you come across what happens with status inside organizations. And what will typically happen is you have the exploiters or execution focused folks who probably have been around the organization longer, or they've been on that business has been around longer, who are probably the cash cow. This isn't always the case.
Right.
Suddenly feel like second class citizens because the exploration, innovation folks are the shiny new object, and they're the cool kids who are trying to drive things
Right.
forward, and that's the future of the business, even if they represent some small portion of revenue at the time, and are probably a cost center, at least as far as the execution focused people feel. And so you end up with these status struggles that maybe it's the right thing to do, and maybe it's the best possible way for an organization to succeed in the long run. But in the short term, dealing with status differences becomes a major issue, because the people that seem to be driving the core business suddenly feel like, wait a second, I'm not welcome here, or I'm not valued here in the way that I should be, given my contribution to the organization. And that creates its own challenges. And so ambidexterity is a great solution for this balancing, but there's lots of delicate interpersonal and intra-organizational challenges that you face in those kinds of scenarios.
Talk to me a little bit about how you think organizations can go about becoming more creative, and how would you relate that to innovation as well?
Sure. So I think there's a direct correlation with creativity and innovation. As I see it, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, innovation is basically creative output finding a market, more or less, if we want to make it sort of simplistic.
Right.
But basically, innovation is taking something that's creative and finding a way to bring it to the market in a way that it latches on, and there's a user base and a customer base, and then that subsequently changes the way that they do business, or changes an industry or something along those. Doesn't necessarily have to be that grandiose. How can organizations do this better? Well, it's not an easy fix, because I would argue that so much of it is cultural. And culture, as we know, is a relatively slow turning ship in terms of trying to change it. However, if you've got a culture that is just so execution oriented, that is so buttoned up, that is really unwilling to watch people try new things, and does not tolerate failure in any way. And I'm not talking about catastrophic failure. I'm talking about small day-to-day, well, this didn't quite work out, or I spent 3 days on this and really didn't lead to anything meaningful. If you've got a culture, or even just people that feel that way, it's going to be real hard to be more creative as an organization. And so I think having senior leaders demonstrate, right, failure is okay, being sufficiently vulnerable enough to talk about their failures publicly and not then, getting punished for it. And in fact, talking about what the benefits of that failure were. And that's the sort of thing that starts to make a culture a little bit more creative. Hiring people that come in and aren't totally encumbered by the status quo of that organization, and giving them the freedom to contribute to the culture in that direction is another way to do it. Encouraging collaboration, especially cross-departmental, right? I come from a network analytic background, and we know that bringing people together from different groups, recombination is the essence of creativity and innovation. And so if you've got very, very siloed organization, it's going to be pretty hard to be creative. And so there's a lot of different elements to it. And it's not always the easiest to do because these require pretty big shifts in lots of organizations. But I do think that there are little steps. And in the same way that building a personal habit of being more creative starts with just these small changes that add up over time, it's going to be true for organizations too. Subtle changes, small things here and there. And you look back in a year or 2 years and say, actually, we've made real progress towards being the type of place that allows the things to happen that enable creativity more commonly.
Yeah. Do you think there's certain types of leadership characteristics that enable this, what you just described, or leadership? I'm not going to use traits, but if any competencies or skills that are needed in order to enable these types of collaboration?
Sure. I think collaborative leaders, right? Those that really encourage people to work across teams, and not just teams for the sake of like having 15 different, people sign off on something, but actually coming together and working together across groups, and enabling those kinds of environments and scenarios. That's a big one. I think, again, that tolerance of failure, that willingness to let people take risks and learn from them. Right. And that's within reason, right? It's not just everybody just kind of failing for the sake of failing all the time, but I tolerating it, understanding that that's part of the process. I think being willing to accept ideas and publicize ideas of others right below you, especially if you're a senior leader, you're a C-suite member, saying, actually, this idea, because the best ideas, or at least a whole host of wide ideas, are not going to come from everybody in the C-suite. They're going to come from people all across the organization. And so encouraging a culture that allows ideas to trickle up and out is another way to make an organization more creative, because it acknowledges that good ideas can come from anywhere. And if it is a good idea, we want to run with it. And so I don't care that you are 7 layers below me in the organization. This was your idea. I want people to know that it was your idea, and I want, to give you the credit for it, and then let somebody run with this. And so those sorts of behaviors and attitudes and approaches are going to be good competencies to encourage creativity across the organization.
Yeah, you've given us so many nuggets today. I think there's so much wisdom in what you've been describing and discussing. I'm also seeing another episode on networks as you talk, because
Sure.
You opened up that can of worms, and that I'm sure people would be really interested to hear more about that. But as we end this, what other words of wisdom would you like to leave the listeners with who are listening to this today, that you haven't shared with us, or that I haven't asked you?
I think the big one for me, because I very much felt uncreative, and that's one of the reasons why I'm studying it in the first place, but also I think tapping into the awe that creativity can provide, right? The reason I love music so much, whether live or recorded, is it can create a sense of awe. Just how did they come up with this? How does that sound make the hair on the back of my neck stand up? Like, why is that? How can I link that this particular song from when I was, sitting on a beach, and I'll use Greece since I know where you're from originally, and I have music that is linked to that. And so creativity can be so incredibly awe-inspiring and just inspirational more generally. And so think about, it doesn't have to be music. Like, what are your hobbies? What are the things that inspire awe in you? Because chances are that's going to be a great source of creative inspiration, or just your motivation to be more creative. And the ideas that you get from that hobby, your ability to pull them into your day-to-day life, professionally, personally, whatever, actually is one of the great sources of creative input. And so don't feel like your hobbies are distractions. In fact, they are fodder and feed for your creative impulses. And so really dig into them and figure out why why they're so inspirational or so interesting to you, and use that as motivation to include in your day-to-day life.
I love it. Thank you for sharing all of those words of wisdom. I have to ask you this last question now, even though I've already finished the podcast technically, but I have to ask you this question. How do you think artificial intelligence is going to impact all of this? Because you talk about inspiration, you talk about human inspiration, you talk about creativity, and now we've got that in the mix.
Yeah.
So there are some implications there from what you just described with the music and all of those things.
Yes,
I just
there are
wanted to
absolutely
leave us with that. Yeah.
So it's already happening, right? There's
Right.
art that's DALL-E, and there's ChatGPT now that everybody's
Right.
flipping out over. And look, there will be AI that creates art. It already happens. It's there.
Right.
There will be large chunks of the marketplace that buy into that and don't care enough about whether it's music or art or whatever, and will accept that as kind of, that is what music is now. Fine. I do, however, think that art's ability to identify and capture and tap into the human experience will mean that some portion of the art market is going to continue to rely on human creators. I actually posted on LinkedIn, and I'm going to read the quote because I found it to be so powerful. So Nick Cave is kind of like a post-punk musician from Australia, but that's putting far too narrow a straitjacket on him. He's a singer, a songwriter, a philosopher. He's had the unfortunate experience of losing, I believe, both of his children. He's in his 60s. He's very thoughtful, and he writes a column that he calls the Red Hand Files. He basically answers people's emails to him. Very thoughtful, very interesting. And he wrote a whole thing on ChatGPT songwriting. And I cut out this one, it's like 4 sentences that I want to read because I think it's such a beautiful encapsulation of, and it captured my feelings about it so well. He said, "Songs arise out of suffering, by which I mean they're predicated upon the complex internal human struggle of creation. And, well, as far as I know, algorithms don't feel. Data doesn't suffer. ChatGPT has no inner being. It has been nowhere. It has endured nothing. It has not had the audacity to reach beyond its limitations, and hence it doesn't have the capacity for a shared transcendent experience, as it has no limitations from which to transcend. ChatGPT's melancholy role is that it is destined to imitate and can never have an authentic human experience, no matter how devalued and inconsequential the human experience may be, it may in time become."
Wow.
And I love, and
I mean, that really captures our conversation.
Exactly. He wrote a whole response that's not particularly lengthy. It'd take you 5 minutes to read. That is beautiful and sad and interesting and compelling. I just think it summed up nicely, and far better than I could have summed up my feelings about it, and why I think that human creation of art will continue to be something that we as human beings turn to and rely on.
And there's something about what you just read that I'm taking a leap on, and that also creativity is an expression, and it's an expression of the inner being, right? And and perhaps even the human soul, whatever that is. So there's something there in what you just described that that touches us. Even when you read that, I'm sure that people could feel that when you were reading that. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I just had to ask you that question at the end.
Yeah.
Because it just seemed so related. Thank you so much, Noah, Dr. Askin, for being with us today and sharing all this wisdom about creativity. I know we just touched the surface, but this is really, really valuable. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun. I appreciate it.